War is often remembered for its grand strategies, famous generals, and decisive turning points. Yet hidden within the massive scale of World War II were strange, tragic clashes that historians still struggle to explain. Among them was a battle so unexpected, so unnecessary, that it seemed almost unreal. It was not a planned offensive or a bold counterattack. It was a confrontation born from confusion, fear, and the fog of war. In the final days of World War II in Europe, when Germany was collapsing and Allied victory was almost certain, one last violent encounter erupted. An engagement that many later described as the battle that shouldn't have happened. Soldiers who were exhausted from years of fighting suddenly found themselves firing at shadows, reacting to incomplete intelligence, and acting on orders that were already outdated by the time they were received. Communications were broken, trust was fragile, rumors spread faster than facts. In this chaotic environment, a single misunderstanding could ignite gunfire. And that is exactly what happened. What makes this battle especially shocking is that it unfolded when surrender was already being negotiated elsewhere. The war was practically over. Yet men still died. It stands as a grim reminder that even when peace is near, war has its own cruel momentum. Once set in motion, it does not easily stop. This story is not just about strategy, it is about human error, fear, pride, and the tragic cost of confusion. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was crumbling under immense pressure. Allied forces were advancing from the west, while the Soviet Red Army pushed relentlessly from the east. Cities lay in ruins. Supply lines were shattered. German soldiers were exhausted, underfed, and often cut off from clear command structures. Adolf Hitler's grip on reality was fading, yet orders to resist at all costs continued to flow through the fractured chain of command. In this environment, misinformation became deadly. Units were frequently isolated, receiving outdated or contradictory instructions. Some commanders believed they were to fight to the last bullet, while others had quietly begun negotiating localized surrenders to spare their men. The Allied troops too were wary. After years of brutal fighting, they had learned that surrender flags could sometimes conceal traps. Trust was scarce on both sides. Tension filled the air in every village and forest clearing. A rumor of an enemy counterattack could trigger immediate defensive action. The psychological strain was enormous. Soldiers slept lightly, weapons always within reach. When peace seems close but not yet guaranteed, nerves become frayed. Every movement appears suspicious. Every sound in the dark could mean danger. It was under these fragile conditions that a tragic misunderstanding escalated into gunfire. No one intended to start a new battle. No general had carefully planned it. Instead, fear and confusion pulled the trigger. In the collapsing chaos of the Third Reich, clarity was a rare commodity, and uncertainty proved more lethal than any weapon. The spark of the battle began with a report, an uncertain one. Scouts relayed information that enemy forces were regrouping nearby, possibly preparing a breakout attempt. The intelligence was vague, yet the possibility of a sudden counterattack could not be ignored. Commanders faced a difficult choice: wait for confirmation and risk being overrun, or strike first to prevent a potential disaster. In wartime, hesitation can be fatal. Acting on incomplete information had become routine. The decision was made to secure the area aggressively. Patrols advanced cautiously, fingers tight on triggers. Across the field, the opposing soldiers were experiencing similar fear. They too had heard rumors, whispers that the enemy might attack despite ongoing surrender talks. Defensive positions were hastily reinforced. Communication lines crackled with static and confusion. Then, a single shot rang out. To this day, no one can say with certainty who fired first. It may have been a nervous sentry, it may have been an accidental discharge. But in war, one shot is enough. Within seconds, machine guns roared and artillery thundered. Soldiers who had expected peace within days suddenly found themselves in a deadly firefight. The tragedy lay not in strategic importance, for the ground gained or lost meant little by then. The tragedy was that this violence served no larger purpose. It did not alter the course of the war. It did not protect a vital city. It simply claimed lives at a moment when the guns should have been falling silent. As the battle intensified, confusion deepened. Units struggled to identify who exactly they were fighting. In some cases, mixed groups of soldiers, those considering surrender and those determined to resist, were tangled together. Orders shouted across the battlefield were drowned out by explosions. Smoke obscured vision. The line between offense and defense blurred rapidly. Some soldiers believed they were repelling an attack. Others, though, they were executing a preemptive strike. Radios malfunctioned, and runners carrying messages were cut down by stray bullets. In the chaos, isolated squads fought desperately without understanding the broader situation. The emotional toll was immense. These were men who had survived years of brutal campaigns. Many had dreamed of going home within weeks. Letters from loved ones sat folded in their pockets. And yet, here they were, risking everything once again. For some, anger replaced fear. They blamed the enemy for refusing to surrender. For others, doubt crept in. Why were they still fighting? But doubt is dangerous in combat. Survival demands focus. And so the firefight continued, hour after hour, fueled less by strategy and more by instinct. The tragedy of this battle was not only its unnecessary nature, but its deeply human dimension. Pride, mistrust, exhaustion, and fragmented leadership combined to create a storm that none of the ordinary soldiers truly wanted. When the smoke finally began to clear, the realization was devastating. Casualties lay scattered across terrain that held no real strategic value. Officers compared reports, and slowly understood that higher command had already moved toward surrender negotiations. The clash had erupted due to outdated intelligence and mutual suspicion. The war, for all practical purposes, was ending. Yet families would soon receive telegrams announcing deaths in what would become one of its final, pointless engagements. Survivors struggled with bitterness. Some felt betrayed by leadership failures. Others wrestled with guilt, questioning whether restraint might have prevented bloodshed. Historians later described the encounter as a tragic symbol of the fog of war, that unpredictable force that clouds judgment and distorts perception. It demonstrated how even at the brink of peace, violence can erupt if communication collapses and fear dominates reason. The battle that shouldn't have happened serves as a haunting reminder that wars do not end cleanly. They fade out unevenly, chaotically, and sometimes violently. Its shock lies not in its scale but in its meaning. It reveals the fragility of peace and the devastating cost of misunderstanding. Even as surrender documents were being prepared elsewhere, men were still dying on the battlefield. And in that painful contradiction lies one of World War II's most sobering lessons. Until the final shot is truly silenced, war remains merciless. In the aftermath of the clash, silence fell heavier than the gunfire had. Medics moved cautiously through the battlefield, treating the wounded regardless of uniform. For a brief moment humanity resurfaced amid devastation. Soldiers who had been trying to kill each other hours earlier now exchanged stunned glances across stretchers and shattered trees. Some even helped carry the injured enemy to safety. It was then that fragments of truth began surfacing. Officers compared maps and radio logs. They realized that surrender talks had already advanced further than many frontline units knew. Some German commanders had been instructed to avoid unnecessary engagements, while Allied leadership was focused on securing territory with minimal additional casualties. Yet these critical updates had not reached everyone in time. The breakdown in communication had been fatal. Many survivors later recalled feeling a hollow sense of disbelief. They had fought bravely, but for what? There had been no decisive objective, no turning point achieved. Just death added to an already unbearable total. For men who had endured Normandy, the Ardennes, Stalingrad, or countless other horrors, this final meaningless firefight felt especially cruel. It symbolized the tragic inertia of war, how violence, once unleashed, can continue moving forward even when logic demands it stop. In their diaries, some soldiers described it as a ghost battle. As though it existed outside reason. It became a painful lesson in how fragile control truly is when armies clash under stress and uncertainty. News of the incident spread slowly through the ranks. Some dismissed it as an unfortunate accident. Others viewed it as proof that discipline had collapsed in the war's final days. High command quietly downplayed the event, unwilling to highlight an engagement that exposed confusion rather than heroism. Official reports framed it as a minor skirmish, avoiding the deeper truth that it should never have occurred at all. Yet among the soldiers who were there, the memory lingered. They spoke of the eerie timing, how victory celebrations were already being whispered about, how rumors of Hitler's impending defeat had circulated widely. The psychological contradiction was intense. One moment they were imagining peace, the next, they were crawling through mud under fire. For many, it permanently altered their perception of war's end. They realized that peace is not a switch that flips instantly. It is a fragile process, vulnerable to misunderstanding and fear. Even as diplomats negotiate and leaders announce surrender, soldiers on the ground may still be operating in yesterday's reality. The battle exposed a painful truth. Wars are not only fought with weapons but also with information. When that information fails, chaos fills the void, and in that void, lives are lost. The engagement became an unspoken reminder among veterans that survival sometimes depends less on courage and more on clarity, something tragically absent that day. Historians later examined the battle as a case study in the fog of war, a concept famously described by military theorist Karl von Clausewitz. He argued that uncertainty is one of war's defining features, that no commander ever possesses perfect information. In this incident, uncertainty reached its peak at precisely the wrong moment. With Germany collapsing and Allied forces pressing forward rapidly, front lines shifted almost daily. Units overlapped. Orders changed quickly. Maps became outdated within hours. In such an environment, even experienced leaders struggled to make sound decisions. The battle that shouldn't have happened illustrated how easily fear can override patience. Both sides believed they might be facing one last desperate offensive. Both acted defensively in what they perceived as self-preservation. Tragically, their mutual suspicion became self-fulfilling. The firefight proved that war's greatest enemy is often miscommunication. A delayed radio message, a misunderstood signal, or a rumor whispered at the wrong time can ignite chaos. This was not a story of strategic brilliance or calculated risk. It was a collision of anxiety and assumption. For military scholars, it became a reminder that discipline alone cannot eliminate confusion. Even well-trained armies are vulnerable when information breaks down. And when that happens near the end of a conflict, the tragedy feels even sharper. Because the violence serves no meaningful purpose, for the families of those who died, the explanation offered little comfort. Official letters described their loved ones as having fallen in honorable combat. Yet the deeper reality, that they perished in an avoidable clash days before peace, remained largely unspoken. Veterans carried that knowledge quietly for years. Some questioned whether more cautious leadership might have prevented the tragedy. Others accepted it as an inevitable consequence of a massive war drawing to a chaotic close. What made the battle so haunting was its timing. It occurred in a moment when hope had finally begun to outweigh fear. Liberation celebrations were already unfolding in some European towns. Civilians cautiously stepped from shelters, believing the nightmare was nearly over. And yet, nearby, guns roared once more. The contrast was painful. It highlighted the uneven way wars conclude. Not with a single unified silence, but with scattered echoes of violence fading at different times. This engagement became one of those echoes. It did not change history books dramatically, but it symbolized something profound. It showed that even when victory is certain, discipline and communication remain vital. Peace demands as much coordination as war does. Without it, even the final days can claim victims. The battle that shouldn't have happened remains a sobering testament to that truth, a final reminder that until the last soldier lowers his weapon, war's shadow still lingers. As time passed, survivors of the battle struggled to explain the event even to themselves. Many veterans later admitted that the memory troubled them more than larger, more famous battles. In major offensives they understood the purpose: territory had to be taken, an enemy had to be stopped. But here, meaning was absent. The fighting felt mechanical, almost automatic, as if the war itself had refused to recognize that its end was near. Psychologists studying combat trauma have often pointed to such moments as particularly damaging. When violence lacks purpose, the human mind struggles to justify it. Soldiers involved in the clash carried unanswered questions for decades. Some asked whether refusing to fire might have saved lives, while others knew hesitation could have meant death for their own unit. This moral tension haunted them. Unlike battles celebrated with medals and memorials, this engagement faded into obscurity. There were no grand monuments, no parades, no clear victory. Instead, there was silence. Veterans rarely spoke of it publicly, sensing that civilians would not understand how a war could continue even after it was effectively decided. The battle exposed a harsh psychological reality. Wars do not end when politicians decide they should, but when the last armed individual accepts that the fight is truly over. Until then, fear continues to dominate instinct, and instinct overrides reason. That uncomfortable truth followed survivors long after the battlefield was abandoned. From a military perspective, the battle became an example of systemic failure rather than individual wrongdoing. Investigations conducted after the war revealed how fragile command structures had become in the final weeks. German units often operated without reliable contact with higher headquarters. Allied forces, advancing rapidly, sometimes lacked clear intelligence about enemy intentions. Both sides were victims of speed. Events moved faster than information could travel. Modern historians argue that the battle illustrates how even technologically advanced armies can lose control under extreme pressure. Radios, messengers, and coded orders all failed in subtle ways. A delayed transmission here, a misunderstood phrase there. Small errors multiplied into deadly consequences. The incident forced military thinkers to reconsider how ceasefires and surrenders should be communicated to frontline units. Lessons drawn from this tragedy later influenced post-war doctrines, emphasizing clearer chains of command and redundant communication systems. Yet these lessons came too late for those who died. The battlefield itself offered no clues to its importance. No decisive ridge, no vital bridge, no strategic city, just ordinary ground soaked in unnecessary blood. In that sense, the battle stands apart from traditional military history. It is remembered not for what it achieved, but for what it revealed about war's inherent chaos. It showed that even the most disciplined systems can unravel when fear, speed, and uncertainty collide. The civilians living near the battlefield experienced the shock in a different way. Many had already begun to hope that their suffering was ending. Some had cautiously emerged from cellars, believing the front had passed. When gunfire erupted again, panic returned instantly. For them, the battle reinforced a cruel lesson. Hope during wartime is dangerous. Liberation could be delayed or reversed at any moment. Later testimonies from civilians described the confusion and terror of that day. They did not understand why fighting had resumed. Rumors spread wildly. Some claimed a secret German counteroffensive was underway, while others believed the Allies were fighting among themselves. The truth was far less dramatic, yet far more tragic. The civilians' experience highlights how ordinary people often suffer most from military miscommunication. They had no control over the decisions being made, yet they endured the consequences. For them, the battle that shouldn't have happened was not an abstract historical concept. It was another day of fear layered onto years of trauma. Long after the war ended, the memory of that unexpected violence lingered in local communities. It became a symbol of war's unpredictability, and the cruel way it disregards human expectations. Even when peace seems inevitable, civilians learn never to trust silence too soon. In the decades following World War II, the battle gradually emerged in memoirs and oral histories. Veterans, now older and more reflective, began to speak more openly. They described the strange atmosphere before the fighting, how the air felt tense yet hopeful, how rumors of surrender circulated alongside warnings of ambush. These first-hand accounts added emotional depth to the historical record. They revealed soldiers not as faceless figures, but as individuals trapped between duty and doubt. Many admitted they sensed the battle was wrong even as it unfolded. Yet war had trained them to act first and question later. This conditioning, necessary for survival in earlier phases of the conflict, became tragic in its final moments. The battle became a case study in how prolonged warfare reshapes human behavior. When violence becomes routine, stopping it requires more than orders. It requires a psychological shift that cannot happen instantly. Historians now view this engagement as a symbolic closing chapter of World War II in Europe. It encapsulates the war's central paradox: massive, carefully planned operations, coexisting with moments of total confusion. The battle that shouldn't have happened reminds us that history is not always driven by grand decisions. Sometimes it turns on fear, misunderstanding, and the tragic inability to recognize that the killing no longer serves a purpose. The moral lessons of the battle extend beyond World War II. Modern conflicts continue to struggle with similar issues. Even today, ceasefires are fragile, and misunderstandings can ignite violence within minutes. The story serves as a warning about the limits of control in armed conflict. Technology may improve, but human psychology remains vulnerable to fear and suspicion. Military planners now emphasize rules of engagement, verification protocols, and de-escalation procedures, precisely because of incidents like this. The battle demonstrates that ending a war is not merely a political act, it is an operational and human challenge. Every soldier must be informed, convinced, and emotionally prepared to stop fighting. Without that alignment, peace remains theoretical rather than real. The tragedy also challenges how we define heroism. There was bravery in the battle, but it was bravery wasted. Courage did not lead to victory, it led to loss. That uncomfortable reality forces us to reconsider romanticized views of war. Sometimes the most heroic act would have been restraint. But restraint is the hardest command to obey when fear dominates. The battle stands as a quiet indictment of war itself, exposing how easily it escapes rational control, and how stubbornly it continues even when its purpose has vanished. Ultimately, the battle that shouldn't have happened endures not because of its scale, but because of its meaning. It represents the tragic inertia of war, the way violence can persist beyond necessity, beyond logic, and beyond morality. It reminds us that peace is fragile and must be actively protected, not assumed. The soldiers who fought in that final unnecessary clash were not villains or fools, they were human beings operating under extreme pressure, guided by fear and incomplete information. Their story challenges us to look beyond simple narratives of victory and defeat. World War II officially ended with signatures and celebrations, but for those caught in this battle, the war ended in confusion and loss. Remembering this event honors them by acknowledging the truth of their experience. It forces future generations to confront an uncomfortable lesson. Wars do not end cleanly, and without careful communication and restraint, even the final moments can turn deadly. The battle that shouldn't have happened is a warning etched into history. One that urges humanity to treat the end of war with as much care and seriousness as its beginning.